Hi, this is Jim. In this video I thought I would share with you some of the various gadgets and gizmos we've accumulated over the last few years, and hopefully you'll find some of them useful. I got to admit I have a certain amount of attraction to gizmos, so you probably won't want all of these, but hopefully one or two will find use in your stockpile. So I'm going to start out with the more electronic gizmos, and then I'll go into the mechanical devices, and at the very end I'll talk about backups when GPS just isn't available. So the first one I talk about is this guy, which is a portable depth sounder, and it's actually sold as a fish finder. I don't fish, so I can't tell you how good it is at finding fish, but it's excellent at measuring depth. This is the transducer, and it has this little float, and so that keeps it at a fixed level relative to the surface of the water. And then the depths, which can be set in either feet or meters, reads out here in the upper left-hand corner. According to the manual, it will also give you an indication as to whether the bottom has rocks or grass. The water's so opaque here in the Bay Area, I can't validate that, but I have checked the depth, and it's spot on. So there's a couple ways you can use something like this. I mean, I can imagine somebody standing up at the bow, and it's like you're tiptoeing through a reef or something like that. But I don't really think that's the best idea. I think the best way to approach this is to use this in your dinghy, and go out. If you're unsure of an anchorage, go out and survey it with this depth sounder before you bring the boat in. So you can have the dinghy lead the boat into the anchorage, or if you want to be a little more systematic about it, you can have the dinghy do a survey and then bring that back to the boat and use the survey to then do an anchorage. Now I've just been experimenting with anchorages in the Bay Area, and so I have cell phone coverage, and I've been using Google Maps to collect the survey data. If you're away from cell phone coverage, there's lots of third-party apps you can use to use your GPS without connectivity. But anyway, it works pretty well with Google Maps. If you're at a certain position, you hold down your finger on the spot where you're currently located, and it's called dropping a pin. And then if you change the label on that pin to your depth in feet, you'll end up being able to have a little marker, or depth in meters, either one. You'll have a little marker with that depth. And so if you do a bunch of those, you'll end up with a picture like this one, which is pretty darn handy. And then you can use that to navigate into the anchorage. I haven't tried it, but according to Google's documentation, if you save that collection of points in a public folder, you can then send it to a friend. Say if somebody else is going to come into the anchorage, you can just send them that file. It'll pop up, and they can use that for their own navigation into the anchorage. Okay, device number 2. Now this is when we're not using the boat, we're in a slip and we have shore power. And one of the things we learned from a yacht broker is that he couldn't sell boats if they didn't smell good inside. And so what he would do when he got a boat for sale is he put this big dehumidifier in it and run it for a couple weeks. It'd suck all the water out of the boat, and the mold just dies. That's the end of it. And so ever since we bought this boat, we've been using various dehumidifiers. The ones we're using now are these little Pro Breeze guys, and we found it best to have one in the V-berth and one in the sink of the galley. The one in the sink of the galley actually drilled a little hole in the reservoir. This is where the water collects, and so it drains down into the tubing that leads from the sink to the through hole. The through hole's closed when we're not on the boat, but it gives you that additional reservoir. The broker did warn me that he's had cases where basically the dehumidifier pulled so much water out it raised a level in the sink. And we're finding every single time we use these, In about a week, the one in the V-berth has completely filled this reservoir. It doesn't matter what the temperature is, what the weather is. There's that much water just from using the boat for a day or a few days. And I think it basically gets absorbed into the cushions and the blankets and everything else. I don't know where all that water goes, but it's always there. When you run these things, you'll find your boat smells wonderful. It sounds like a small thing, but we've actually had people come onto a boat and say, this doesn't smell like a boat. It's probably the best compliment we've ever gotten. So, highly recommended. I don't know how much power they take. Our power bills are really small, so it can't be too much, but they're well worth it. Okay, well, one more electronic device, and I had to be talked into buying these. Friends of ours said, "You'll love them, just quit arguing and buy them." These are hands-free walkie-talkies, and they were originally sold under the brand name Marriage Savers, which if you've ever seen a couple yelling at each other over a botched anchorage, you'll understand. Anyway, I don't think these are available per se anymore, which is really a shame, but you can accomplish the same thing by buying 2 walkie-talkies that have the headphone jack, and just buy those like telephone operator headsets that go over have a little microphone and go over your head. One ear is fine. And what you'll find if you take a chance and buy these is it just transforms anchoring and mooring for that matter. Because the basic problem in anchoring is the person at the bow can see everything, but they don't have any control of the boat. And the person at the helm, of course, has control of the throttle and the helm, but their view is blocked. They don't really know what they're doing. And so this leads to hand signals and all sorts of stuff. When you have these on, what we've ended up doing is I'm always at the bow, and I just give helm directions to Claire. And so she doesn't know exactly why I'm telling her quarter turn to starboard, idle forward, things like that. She just does it, and she can sort of figure out watching it. But it just takes all the stress out of it. I can guide the boat right up to where I want to drop the anchor. And it's really handy when you're trying to pull up an anchor that's stuck deep in the mud. Here in the Bay Area, we have this gelatinous goo. Silt isn't a good description of it. It's more like axle grease that coats our bottom. And if you're patient when you're anchoring, you can get your anchor down 10, and I've heard 15 feet into this goo, which gives just fabulous holding. The problem is when you come to get the anchor up, you still have fabulous holding, even when you're right above the anchor. And so the technique, we all use is to motor up to right above the point where you're anchored. I tie off the rode, and then I give clear directions to back, and we pull some of that, pull the anchor up some, and then I'll give her directions to get back to that spot, pull in whatever slack I've gotten, do it again. It usually takes 3 or 4 times before I've got the anchor loose, and then at that point, all I have to do is lift the chain and the anchor, and this incredible accumulation of muck all over the anchor. And you'd want to do that same technique even if you have a windlass, because the windlass is not stressed to pull several tons of mud up. You'll just trip the breaker and potentially damage the windlass. The windlass is only designed to lift the weight of the chain and the anchor itself. So, use that same procedure whenever you get something really stuck in the mud. But I really can't tell you how transformational these things are. I'm very glad our friends talked us into buying them. Okay, let's switch over to mechanical devices. The first mechanical device I'm going to show you is an amazing boat hook. This is it right here. It's telescopes to an incredible length, and you can use it as a regular boat hook if you just clip this arm right here away. But the magical thing about it is that this boat hook, when you grab onto something, will put a line through a loop. And all you have to do is, if your rope doesn't have an eye, just put a bowline on it, and you put the rope right here. And then when you're grabbing something, you keep the line on top of the hook, and when you pull it, this arm extends and it rotates this ring in here and pulls the line to the other side. And I'll just go out and to the stern and demonstrate using the stern pulpit. You can see how it works. So it's pretty magical, really, when you see that happen. And I don't claim to fully understand how this mechanism works, but I'm really in awe of the designer. So this is called a Rob Ship hook&moor, and it's very valuable. So the next device I wanted to talk about is the boom brake. And some people confuse this with a preventer, and they're really complementary and quite different devices. A preventer is a line that you take from the aft end of your boom forward, and it stops the boom from jibing, and that's, you know, a vital piece of safety equipment if you're going for long periods of time offshore on a downwind tack. The boom brake is sort of the opposite. In the boom brake, you're intending to jibe, and the objective is to take a lot of the energy out of that boom as it's swinging across during the jibe and chew up that energy and friction so that you don't slam the boom into the other side of the rig, which can be really damaging. So the way this particular boom brake works is I have a line tied off on the port side of the boat, and it runs up through the boom brake, which has several wheels in it where the friction occurs, and then it goes to a block on starboard and then back to a cam cleat in the cockpit. And if the line isn't tight, the boom brake really doesn't do anything, it's just idle. But if you tighten that line, it tightens the line inside of the boom brake and adds a whole bunch of friction. On this particular model, the amount of friction is adjustable with this knob, and that's handy because brand new lines are pretty slick and you'll need a fair amount of tightening on it. And then as the line ages, it gets a little rougher on the outside, and you can actually slack off a bit to provide the same level of friction. And so this is really nice. It allows you to jibe safely in stronger winds. It's also useful in very light wind conditions when the boom is just going to flop around. And so what you do is basically push the boom off to whatever side you want to keep it on, set the boom brake, and that amount of friction will just keep it there. And so you've got a much better chance of catching little puffs and propelling the boat forward than if the boom was just flopping around. I think of it in that sense, I think of it a little bit like having a whisker pull and a jib in light winds. It's the same benefit. And that brings me to whisker poles. We've done a lot of charters, and none of the charter boats ever have whisker poles. And after you're used to sailing with a whisker pole, you really miss it when you don't have one. It's essentially required equipment if you're going to spend a long time going downwind at anything deeper than about 120 degrees, you know, a broad reach. Anything deeper than that, the jib is just going to be unstable. And so particularly for wing on wing, you just have to have a whisker pole. And a good example is, you know, last Saturday on the way home we got into some light winds, and we were you know, wing on wing sailing straight downwind. Without a whisker pole, you know, the jib would have collapsed and flapped around and been useless. But you can see from this video that, you know, the whisker pole holds it out there, and the jib does move in the puffs, but it's always in position. And we were able to get about 3 knots of boat speed and sailed all the way back to the marina, which I always consider to be a major victory when we don't have to motor. So let me just take you through how I've rigged our whisker pole, trial and error over the years. So on the mast, I just have a fixed ring, and that's at the height of the clew of the jib. And the ring works fine for the whisker pole, but it turned out to be a jib sheet catcher when you're sailing upwind, because that little notch in the ring is just perfect for catching a jib sheet. So recently I've fashioned a piece of plastic to basically smooth over that so the jib sheet doesn't have any place to catch. And it's just attached to the back part of the ring that isn't used by the whisker pole with some zip ties. And I haven't had any problem with the jib since then. So I just used a piece of plastic from a thick cutting board as the stock. I made a cardboard template to work out exactly the shape and then cut it out with a handsaw. And it works fine. On the jib end of things, I used to hook the whisker pole up to the actual jib sheet, but I found it's much better to just have an extra little ring up there. It's a stainless ring that's connected with a little Dyneema loop and a shackle, and that's what I hook the whisker pole to. Now we're always sailing short-handed or single-handed, and so I've developed some habits that make it easier to manipulate the whisker pole when you don't have somebody up there to fight with the jib and hook it up. Now this works because I've got a typical furling jib, which is 110% jib. This wouldn't work with a hanked-on jib. But the basic idea is you use the furler as part of the system to manage the whisker pole. So to attach the whisker pole, what I do is roll up the jib most of the way, and then I go forward and click the whisker pole into both of the rings. And on the way aft, I move the jib cars aft so that they'll be pulling mostly aftward when you sheet in. You don't want downward tension when you're sailing downwind. And then back in the cockpit, I unfurl the jib and pull it in, and of course now the whisker pole is deployed. And the beauty of this thing is that you can use the same attempt when you need to switch the whisker pole to the other side, which happens all the time, just because of wind shifts or because slight changes in the angle you're sailing. What I do is roll the jib up part way and just pull on the other sheet. It swings it across, and I don't have to go forward and do anything. And because of that ring is independent of the sheet, the jib, basically has the same extension on either side. And of course, when it comes time to take in the whisker pole, I just roll up the jib and go up there and take it off, and I'm back where I'm started. So I consider whisker pole to be really mandatory equipment if you're going to be sailing downwind with white sails. Once you've gotten used to it, you'll never want to sail without it. So the last subject I thought I ought to cover was backups when your GPS isn't working for one reason or another. And if you watched other videos, I'm a big fan of chart plotters, and I have 2 of them on this boat. But you can't really rely on them. And we've had several situations, particularly on charter boats, where the chart plotter was non-functional. In the Sea of Cortez, we had a working chart plotter, but according to the charts, we sailed through islands and we anchored on top of small mountains. The charts were just way off. And I think the reason for that is whoever created those charts had started with probably British Admiralty charts, and those were done in the days of celestial navigation and before there were digital clocks. And so if the timepiece was off by 10 seconds, then, they'd be off by a couple miles. And that's okay if you're way away from land, but when you're coming into an anchorage, a couple miles is enormous. And it's hard to describe how disconcerting it is when there's an instrument you're used to relying on, and it's just giving you bogus information. It's really better to just put the cover on the thing, shut it off, and use your paper charts and go from there. Another charter, we were up in British Columbia in Desolation Sound. This beautiful boat. The GPS antenna had been mounted on the stern pulpit to get it away from the mast, which is great, except somebody had then built a bimini, and they put 2 of the cross beams right over the GPS antenna. And if that wasn't enough, they didn't install a barbecue on top of that. So the GPS never got a signal, not once. And Desolation Sound's an area where you really have to be on your toes with navigation, because there's a lot of submerged rocks, and there are large submerged reefs that are really right in the path you would take if you didn't know about them. And so what I always do on this boat and on any charter is I always take paper charts along, and I take the necessary equipment to follow angles across the chart. I prefer these to the parallel rulers. These little rollers allow you to scoot across the chart. And then I bring along this pair of binoculars that have a built-in compass, which you can see as you're sighting an object. And even in a pretty nasty swell, if you're patient and keep looking, you can get an angle to an object within a couple degrees. If it's calm, you can get it within 1 degree easily. But it's a lot easier than those hand bearing compasses to use the ones with the compass built into the binoculars, and you get a better view of the object you're sighting. So if you just take two objects you can see off the chart, and you using the compass rose, follow those magnetic lines to a point, the interception is where you are. A lot of times you can double check that if you have a working depth sounder by comparing your depth to whatever you see on the chart, and they should agree after you correct for the tide. So anyway, I can't stress enough the importance of always having a paper backup and some means of navigating. We were down in Belize, and we had both a handheld marine navigation GPS chart plotter and the ship's chart plotter, and neither one of them really agreed with where the obstacles were. They agreed on the general layout of the land masses and everything, but when you got to actually, what do I need to know when I anchor, they disagreed. And furthermore, neither one of them seemed to agree with what we were seeing with our own eyes. And this may be sort of inevitable. Belize is the second largest coral reef in the world. It's a beautiful area to sail in. And the land masses are really just sandbars. And so they get moved around when there's big storms that sweep through there. And so, it's probably not possible to have an up-to-date chart all the time. But again, the GPS was actually a distraction. It was better to just shut the thing off and use our eyes and the paper chart as a reference, and put people on the bow to look for rocks. And the water is so clear there, you can see the coral ways off. And so that's how we did it, and it worked fine. But again, as much as I like chart plotters, they have their limits. Now, I'm not in a position to do long ocean passages, but if I were to do that now, I would definitely bring along charts and a means to navigate. And the reason for that is that it's inevitable that sooner or later some global conflict is going to break out. So imagine the US and China getting into a squabble over Taiwan. Your GPS coverage is just going to be shut off, just like that. And I've actually experienced this flying. Some years ago, I was flying my glider in the Eastern Sierras, and all of a sudden the main GPS started acting really funny. And so I power cycled it, rebooted it, and it was still acting weird. And so then I had a handheld backup that I got out of the pocket and turned it on, and it wasn't working right either. So anyway, I had charts, and I had learned to fly long before GPSs, so I didn't have any trouble getting home. But it was unnerving. And what I found out was the military was practicing jamming GPSs on that day. And believe me, this GPS jamming does work. Your GPS just acts totally screwy. And so you can imagine that anytime any significant conflict broke out, that you're just going to lose GPS coverage, and you don't know when you're going to get it back. And so if you're in the middle of the ocean, that's a big deal. So I've been experimenting just using this plastic Davis sextant, which I'm actually pretty impressed with. Davis is a company here in the Bay Area in Hayward. And so I've been practicing over the last couple months, just seeing how good I could get doing sun sights. And frankly, it takes some practice. It's not something you can pick up in a day. And so, you know, after a couple of months of practicing on and off, I've gotten to the point, or first of all, I can do the calculations real quick. And they're all addition and subtraction, so it's not like you have to be a math whiz, but you do have to know the sequence, and you have to have the nautical almanac and the sight reduction tables for the range of latitudes you're going to be sailing in. But I've gotten to the point where I'm consistently within about plus or minus 3 miles of the location. A friend of mine using the same compass has gotten to the point where he's within plus or minus 2 miles. I think with a really good metal sextant, you can probably get under a mile. But, you know, even plus or minus 3 miles, I'm not going to miss Hawaii if I'm 3 miles off one way or the other. I mean, I can see a big rock. So I think, you know, I'm already good enough that, you know, I'd feel comfortable that if, you know, something bad happened and GPS coverage was shut off, you know, I could get to where I needed to go. And I'd really encourage everybody, it's actually a lot of fun to learn how to use a sextant. This was only about $180. It wasn't a huge investment. And it also gets you in touch with how people used to do things, which is pretty darn interesting. If you read some of the older cruising books, just how impressive some of the feats of navigation they accomplished were. You'll really appreciate it after you've tried to do it yourself. Okay, that's the end of this video. As always, I enjoy the comments and suggestions I get, so feel free to leave them and have fun sailing.